So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome here to UCC to listen to us speaking about energy. My name is Tim Hayes, and I am Head of Communication at the European Commission representation in Ireland. And before COVID, if you remember those days, we used to regularly do events around the country on various subjects where we listened to what people thought and we tried to tell them what it was that the European Union thought on various subjects. So at the moment, energy for us is the big field, and it's something that we think it's worth considering. So what we've done today is we've assembled a very high-level panel to speak about the subject. We haven't given them any instructions about what it is that they're to speak about, but after they're finished speaking, the floor is open for questions to the panel, and I will be taking questions both from the floor here. And from Slido, where our people who are watching online can send in questions as well. Because this event is being taped and you can watch it back later on YouTube, and people are watching it live on YouTube as well. So, as I say, it's a great pleasure for us to be able to organise this in conjunction with the European movement. And just to underline what we're looking at here, so we're looking at the Russian attack on Ukraine, which has had an incredible impact on the way we think about energy. I mean, once upon a time, we took energy for granted, but every time now you look at your electricity bill, you realize that there has been an increase. And the difficulty is that the Russians have been using energy as a weapon of war against the West. And this is one of the things that we must concentrate on to see how it is that we can loosen our grip on fossil fuels and move away to more renewable sources of energy. And also, so we're looking at things like wind energy, we're looking at hydrogen, we're looking at all these various different forms of energy, which you'll hear about in a moment from the panel. So what's going to happen is that the panel are going to speak, each of the members of the panel will speak from the podium here for about 7 minutes, no longer than 7 minutes, each in turn. And then we're going to throw the floor open for questions, and I will direct questions at members of the panel. So we should be finished at about 1:45 or thereabouts. Okay. So the first panel member I want to introduce is Professor Brian Norton, and Professor Norton is Head of Energy Research at the Tyndall National Institute, which is part of UCC here. And he is Professor of Solar Energy Applications at Technical University of Dublin as well. He's also a member of the Royal Institute of the Royal Irish Academy, and this is Ireland's highest academic organisation. He's also a fellow of the Irish Academy of Engineering. And he actually is an awful lot more on his CV, but the trouble is that, we want to start the discussion rather than listening to people's CVs. So I'll move on to the next panellist, who is Catherine Sheridan. And Catherine is the Chief Operating Officer of EIH2. So this is Ireland's first green hydrogen production company, and her focus is on energy system integration and the role for green hydrogen in supporting Ireland and to allow Europe to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So she's a chartered engineer by profession. She's also a fellow of Engineers Ireland, and she's on the board of Cork Chamber, also council member of Wind Energy Ireland, and with a policy lead in hydrogen. And the final panelist that we have is Shane Cooney, and Shane is the project manager for the Celtic Interconnector. So that is the, well, electricity wire, which is going to connect Ireland with France and allow us to export green energy into France. So Shane is the onshore project manager, and this project got funding of some 500 million euro from the Connecting Europe facility. So therefore the European Union is heavily invested in making sure this project works. And Shane has over 20 years experience in the power sector, delivering large capital projects both in Ireland and internationally. So now that I've introduced the panel, I just want to indicate that, you know, there is no sort of hidden agenda here from the European Commission. You know, we haven't given any indication whatsoever to any of the panelists how it is that they should speak. So this is really a frank and open discussion, and we're depending very much on them and their experience to tell us, you know, the way that we should think for the future. And then hopefully we get some interesting questions from you here and from the people online that we can put to the members of the panel and hopefully have a nice discussion. So I'd like to call on our first panel member, please. Brian, would you mind speaking from the podium, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay at the back? I usually get told off for shouting, so apologies for that. The particular time we're in, as I've said, has a public awareness of energy, which is rather like the public awareness in COVID, that we all become virologists. You know, we all become experts on energy. The danger in that is latching on to particular solutions out of context. What we have is essentially two challenges. The very short-term challenge of security of supply, essentially, has been described, for which the interventions are essentially financial, fiscal, and regulatory interventions, both at the consumer end, in the supply chain, and at the production end. And you saw some of those in the slide. I won't reiterate them. The slides that have been shown before we started. And they are essentially financial measures of one sort or another, because that's all you can do in the short term. The challenge with that is not to lock in things in the long term that are going to prevent the technological changes, the social, regulatory, and business model changes that are necessary for energy transition in the medium to long term. Those changes are much more reduction of energy use at the demand side, so refurbishment of buildings, decarbonisation of high temperature industrial processes, cement production, for example, decarbonisation of transport. So there's a whole plethora of policies around that reduce the actual supply, and then meeting that supply through a diversified set of renewables, wind, solar, hydro, etc., and maybe in the future more ocean energy, etc. So that you have a system which is much more local. Part of the key to succeeding in that is to have effective energy storage. And I often talk about the where, what, and when of energy storage, because again, there's no simple answer. Where you store energy can be at a variety of scales, from the domestic, doing it at home, through to the vehicle, through to at the point of production of the energy, maybe next to the PV array, for example, through to other locations as a service, okay? What you store is important. You could be storing as electricity, you could be storing as pumped hydro, for example, you could be storing in the long term and for applications in heavy industry and transport as hydrogen. So you've got that kind of, and then the other challenge, which is also not thought, is when do you store energy? And in a domestic situation, for example, you might store energy what you're not using to use at other times. Other things might be continuously storing energy as a kind of backup to the grid. And what you end up with is a variety of scales of system, so that you're enabling what are called prosumers, people who are both producing and consuming energy at the domestic scale to essentially offset their energy consumption with energy production, through to a macro allocation of energy through a grid. The fundamental change in all this is that you need to start from the bottom up. Traditional power planning has started from the top down, from the power station, okay, in one location, central. You're now seeing much more distributed generation, and it's important to link that directly to distributed consumption. And so you're seeing a much more complex set of grids at a variety of scale. The final key point I'd make before I finish, and just conscious of time here, is that we're in a situation where you have an energy market, but there are clear policy goals from government. There are clear issues to do with the ability of certain people in fuel poverty, for example, to pay for energy, that mean that that is not a perfect market. It's not a free market in any sense. And that brings its own challenges, but it also brings an opportunity for that market to be gamed by various players at various levels. So one of the key challenges is the regulation of that market in all its different dimensions going forward in the interests of consumers. So whether it's building refurbishment and the cost of that and the payback of that, that's the cost as tight as possible, whether it's in the allocation of contracts for renewable energy generation, that there are not excessive profits, for example, how prices are set in markets, all those things are points of regulation that need to be given increased attention in the particular transition we're making as well. I'll finish there in the interest of time. I'm sure some of these things will come up in questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Brian, and particularly for your succinctness and the way you were able to encapsulate such fantastic ideas into such a short period of time. I'd like to call on Catherine Sheridan. Catherine, your 7 minutes start now on your special.
Thanks a billion. So, Brian, is it okay if I use up your spare time that you had there? So thanks to everybody, and especially as a proud European, I'm delighted to be invited to speak today. I'm also intensely proud to be Irish, but most importantly, I'm from Cork. So I find the ability to think of those three things together and to be able to absorb them has very much been enabled for me because I've been constantly thinking of the energy trilemma. So it's what the World Energy Council advises us to do when we're thinking about an energy system. We need to think, can it be affordable, can it be sustainable, and also can it provide us with the security of supply? So thankfully the European Union very much saw the need for this when they set up the European Green Deal. So this is an idea of how could we decarbonise our energy systems and become the first net zero economy by 2050. And then furthermore, in 2020, they brought out the Energy System Integration Strategy. And I absolutely love the Energy System Integration Strategy because it's really sensible and we're Irish and there's no waste not, want not. You finish what's on your plate when you're having your dinner. You can't let anything go to waste. So the Energy System Integration Strategy looks at moving away from thinking of energy in terms of straight lines and moving it into circles. So instead of just thinking, we take a fossil fuel out of the ground in the form of oil, we refine it, we burn it in a car and we leave emissions go up and that's the end of it. We start thinking of it in terms of circles. So for example, we could be using the heat. So say you've got a data centre and you're cooling the data centre by taking the heat out of it. Well, you could use that heat for district heating and heat homes. So that's kind of a circular way of looking at it. Or another example is we've got food waste in our country, unfortunately, but that food waste could be used to create biogas, and that biogas in turn could be used to generate electricity. The European Union went one step further and they wanted to really truly integrate the energy system. They wanted to integrate the electrons and the molecules. So the electrons are our electricity system where the wind blows and it turns turbines and that generates electricity. But also we need a way of storing that electricity, storing that energy that's in electricity, transporting it around the place. And that's when the idea of hydrogen comes into play. So in parallel with the Energy System Integration Strategy, the hydrogen strategy came out at the same time. So a quick wind back to junior cert science, because it really isn't any more complicated than that. You pass renewable electricity through water, H2O, and the electricity causes the H and the O to separate out, and you've got hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen can be used for things like wastewater treatment. So that's one use of it, again, with the circular economy. And then the hydrogen, it's a fuel, it's an energy source, and it can be used to displace the use of fossil fuels that we have today. So for example, things that you can't plug in, like ships or planes or heavy goods vehicles, you could use hydrogen in those instances. Similarly, if you've got high heat industry, like the steel and the cement we desperately need for our homes, you could use hydrogen instead of fossil fuels in that instance. But when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, we need a backup for our electricity. We need to be able to have a fuel and for thermal generation. Today that's fossil fuels, but in the future, if we store up our wind at times of excess, we can store it as hydrogen. And people like ESB and Decarbonex and SNAM are looking at storing that hydrogen in geological features, like in salt caverns, for example. We can store lots of energy and it means it's an indigenous form of energy. At the moment in Ireland, we're importing way too much energy to be considered anywhere near independent. We've got about 70% of our natural gas coming in via the interconnector, which means we've got 30% of indigenous energy along with a little bit of wind and a little bit of solar. We need to move away from that. Fit for 55 came out, and that was an accelerated ambition by the European Union to have a 55% reduction in the emissions by 2030. So things were looking really good. We were really on track for the sustainability aspect of the energy system. However, we know there's three legs to the stool. There's also the affordability and there's the security of supply. When Putin and Russia attacked Ukraine, we became acutely aware in a way that we hadn't perhaps last year about the energy system. Last year, we were just getting our heads around getting back to normal after COVID, and we were able to tolerate the risk that was there around energy security and also the affordability of it. But when Putin invaded, it gave us a salience of the threat that was there. There was a bad guy. So Europe rallied round and came up with RePowerEU, which is looking at saving energy, displacing fossil fuels, reducing our demand on Russian imports that are financing the war, and accelerating the deployment of renewables onto our system, including quadrupling the amount of hydrogen that was proposed to be in the energy system. So if we think about it, what does it mean for us in Ireland in relation to being part of a European energy system? It's great. We can export some of our electricity that we've taken from the wind via fantastic infrastructure projects like the Celtic Interconnector. But we can also do more. For us in Ireland to attract foreign direct investment by large energy companies like the Iberdrolas, like the Shells, like the Equinors, we need to give them an economic carrot in proportion to the amount of energy we have, not the domestic need that we have. In parallel, we're a source of energy. Countries like Germany want to import 80% of their hydrogen. So they're a sink, we're a source. We can play our part in relation to it. But then again, we're from Cork. So look at what we've got here. We've got incredible centres of excellence when it comes to research and development. I see around the room incredible energy professionals from the likes of Simply Blue, from my colleagues in EIH2 and Green Rebel, from DP Energy. There's an opportunity for us to become a hub. We've got the port, we've got the energy off the coast of Ireland, but we've also got the rebel spirit. And in this time, I would call upon people to consider being a rebel in a slightly different way. Be a rebel by collaborating, by creating new ways of considering value creation. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We don't have to have somebody else lose for us to win. That's what Russia wants. Russia wants to see everyone else losing and them winning, but that's not the European way. The European way is one of partnership and working together, because climate change doesn't care where the emissions come from. We don't want one country to be successful. We want all the countries to be successful. And that's what it brings back to being from Cork and from Ireland in Europe, is the counterpoint to the energy trilemma. Thank you.
Because obviously Cork is the place to be. But I really liked the idea of waste not, want not. I think it was fabulous, and you gave a great overview of the circular economy. So the next person that we have to speak is Shane, and as I said, Shane manages the Celtic Interconnector project. Shane, the floor is yours, please, 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So I'll make the connection to Cork as well, like Catherine. So it was interesting from Brian of the Tyndall Institute. You know, the Tyndall Institute is named after John Tyndall, who actually pioneered our whole understanding of climate change and the effect of gases in the atmosphere on that way back in the 19th century. He was way ahead of his time. And coincidentally, when John Tyndall left a hedge school in Carlow, his first job was actually in the Ordnance Survey office in Youghal, which is my hometown. And Youghal Beach is where EirGrid will be bringing the Celtic Interconnector cables on shore. So EirGrid are the transmission system operator in Ireland. So the transmission system is the cables, the overhead lines, the underground cables that are like the highways for transporting the electricity from where it's generated to where it's needed. And what EirGrid do also is we plan the future upgrades of the grid so that we're able to cater for new connection of new generation and the mix of generation that's required, and also the consumers, the demand side that's going to be there. So I'm the onshore project manager for the Celtic Interconnector project. This is a 700 megawatt subsea connection linking the Irish transmission system with the French transmission system. It's a huge project. It's over an investment of over 1 billion euros. And as Tim pointed out in his introduction, we've secured EU grant funding of over 500 million euros, as it has been designated a project of common interest for the EU because it's linking EU grids, it's connecting the energy markets of us to our nearest EU neighbour is now France post-Brexit. It enhances the security of supply, and it also will drive down costs of energy for consumers, but most importantly, it goes towards helping us achieve our climate action ambitions. So EirGrid's shaping our electrical future is our plan for 2030 and beyond. So we have a target that by 2030, over 70% of all electricity usage will come from renewable generation. And further beyond that by 2050, we'll have a zero carbon system. So at the moment, we only have over 40% of renewables, so there's a long way to go, but we already have a grid that is capable of dealing with 75% of renewables on the grid. And that's actually a world-leading benchmark. Nobody else achieved that before Ireland, but that's not enough. By 2030, in order to achieve that 70% target, we're going to need a grid that can deal with 95% of renewables on the grid. And that's where solutions like hydrogen generation, battery storage come in, as well as interconnectors. So unfortunately, renewable generation, we can't control when it's available as such. Sometimes there's too much wind, sometimes there's not enough wind. But with an interconnector like the Celtic interconnector, when we have surplus wind, we'll be able to export that to France and sell it, rather than what we at the moment sometimes have to curtail wind. And when we can't use the renewable energy that we produce here, developers lose out. So by being able to sell it, we create a more attractive economic model for developers to invest. When we don't have enough renewable energy, Celtic interconnector will give us access to the French grid for importing power. And the French is one of the lowest carbon grids in Europe. So the Celtic interconnector, it's a huge undertaking. It's 500 kilometers from Youghal Beach to France, so we have to manufacture and lay that cable at sea. We have a 40-kilometer underground cable route on land. And it's been years to get to this point where we have secured all the consents and approvals required to proceed with the project. We hope to sign contracts this month to proceed with manufacturing and construction, to have the Celtic interconnector energized by 2026. But what we've learned along the way with the Celtic interconnector is you need to bring the local communities along with you. We have plans for a huge amount of infrastructure to build over the next 10 to 20 years. And you do need to engage with local communities, make sure they're involved early in the decision-making process. And look, our consultations on our shaping our electrical future showed that local communities, they need to see that there are benefits not just on a national or European level, that there have to be benefits for them locally. To that end, on Celtic Interconnector project, we established a community forum and a community benefit fund of 2.4 million euros for local communities to allocate to projects of their choosing. But I mean, for the future, in our transition to the zero carbon electrical future, the coastal communities are going to play a huge part really in facilitating that transition. So we do need to engage with them and show that there are benefits to this. So on that note, I'll hand back to Tim.
Okay, Shane, thank you so much for that. A nice explanation of what it is that we're going to do for the future to ensure that there's interconnectivity between France and Ireland. So now it's time for questions and answers. And I think what we'll do is we'll start here with the audience. So if anybody in the audience wants to ask a question of the panel, can you please indicate? And if you represent an organisation, can you please explain to us which organisation you represent? If there are no questions here in the audience, then we move straight to the questions that are coming in on Slido. So any takers in the audience here for questions for the panel, please? Okay, so a gentleman here in the blue suit and then a lady at the back.
Good afternoon. Brian Fitzgerald. I'm from Simply Blue Group, floating offshore wind developer. The RePowerEU has really, I think, triggered all member states to speed up their processes towards certainly permitting and consenting. How can Ireland, we'll say, account for to the EU, or vice versa? How can the EU help Ireland develop a consenting and permitting system that respects the participative democracy principles of the European Union, but at the same time makes sure that we deliver our climate targets?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. It's probably a question that you're addressing to the European Commission, but this is not about the Commission today, it's about the panellists, okay? So can I please ask Brian if he would answer some of that question at least, Brian?
I think can you hear me okay? The Irish planning system has, and the consent system is start with complex and has a long history and is intertwined with whole issue with, as you say, national identity and public participation. So I think that makes it particularly difficult to take models that work elsewhere and bring them into the Irish context. But where I would start, if you could do that, was look at perhaps some of the Danish models that have been applied where your process is almost in reverse, in that you have a process which designates areas for particular purposes, and then people bid into the use of those areas, so that the public process is taking place outside of a particular developer's self-interest, if you see what I mean. And I think something like that might be the way forward, but it would need to be very carefully introduced into the Irish system, because you can't just translate something from one situation to another, because they're all so national. But something like that is probably part of the solution.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Let's move on to another question from the audience. I'd like to keep this a bit interactive. As I say, a lady up here at the back and then a lady down here at the front. Okay, so again, up at the back, if you can just explain if you're from an organisation, which organisation you represent.
Thanks. You saved me from typing, so thank you. Sarah Foley is my name. I'm with Erstel. We're a global renewable energy company active in offshore and onshore renewable technologies. I am wondering, RePower really upped the ante and put a lot of very ambitious new targets for Europe, which was great to see. But right now as well, there's COP27 is happening as we speak here. I'm interested just to hear from the panelists. What would you like to see come out of COP as well, and anything there that you might be watching for as well to really grow even further in Ireland as well, and what to look out for? Thank you.
Okay, Sarah, thanks very much for that question. Indeed, we all would like to know what's going to come out of COP. But I think your question, I'll address Catherine. Catherine, would you mind taking that question, please?
Hi, Sarah, and apologies that I didn't acknowledge Orsted being in the room earlier on when I was name-checking the fabulous Cork companies. I don't know about you, but COP in some ways is almost becoming populist. It's almost being sponsored by Coca-Cola, and it's a bit different. But that's being held in parallel with incredible representatives that are going. I mean, from UCC alone, Dr. Marguerite Nyan, Dr. Hannah Daly, and another cohort of really passionate environmentalists are going there. So what I want to see happening out of COP is that the noise and the private jets and the virtue signalling is filtered out, and the actual people who have the research and the expertise to back up their opinions that they're listened to. So the bringing it together with COP and RePowerEU, we're moving away from a dependence on Russian fossil fuels. What we have to be careful is that we don't create a new form of geopolitical threat to the energy system. So, for example, one that I would be concerned about is when we're creating a new energy map, when we're relocating where our sources and sinks of energy, that we don't create a new form of colonialism where we're creating a situation that African renewables have to be exported to Europe because the price is higher there, and then we're preventing those countries from having an opportunity to develop and catch up with their economics that we are there. So again, my war cry is always systems thinking. What we need to make sure we do is consider all the implications of the changes we're making. And that's why we should look perhaps to relying on the European 27 to be providing energy. So even though Irish energy may initially cost more in money terms than perhaps importing solar-powered electricity or hydrogen from Namibia, it's a more democratic form of energy. So the long-term benefits to geopolitical stability are worth the additional monetary cost, I think.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Catherine. We'll take one more question in the room, then we move to the questions that are coming in online, and then in a minute we'll go back again to the questions in the room. So the lady here in the front row, again, can you please tell us who you're representing, if you represent an organisation?
My name's Liz Dunphy and I'm with the Irish Examiner. I just have three really small little questions, if that's okay. One, the establishment of this new government body from January, I think it's called MARE, to deliver foreshore licences and the like, whether that gives the panel here much hope that kind of particularly offshore wind projects will be speeded up. Also, I don't know if this is the right forum for this question, but there was an article in the Business Post on Sunday which was talking about the Shannon Estuary wind development project, and they said that it could deliver at a baseline estimate something like 6 times the amount of energy we need to produce in Ireland. How long do you think that project, I don't know if you know, but how long would that project maybe take to get off the ground? When could we look at dealing with that? And also, just lastly, I think, Shane, you mentioned that the interconnector would be operational by 2026. I just wanted to double check if I heard that correctly. Yeah, okay. And will that, I presume, that will be a fundamental part of being able to deal with this whole new kind of ecosystem of energy generation within Ireland by being able to cope with all this hopefully new energy coming onto the grid from wind.
Okay, thanks very much, Liz. I actually think a lot of those questions are directed directly towards Shane, because you spoke earlier about how you dealt with the local population. You spoke about having to get foreshore licenses. So maybe you'd be able to tackle the question that Liz asks you.
Yeah. So, well, firstly, in terms of Celtic Interconnector, it's really step one in being able to deal with the future offshore wind that is planned for Ireland. So we're going to need more interconnectors than just the Celtic. It's not going to solve everything, but we are getting it in place. In time, it'll be operational in 2026. So in terms of the planning for offshore wind, yes, the new legislation, is a welcome development. It's obviously taken looking at the future developments that are necessary offshore, as opposed to the old foreshore license legislation, which was in place before we ever even had thought about the possibility of offshore wind. In terms of offshore wind development, and you mentioned the Shannon Estuary. Phase one of offshore wind is underway at the moment, which is off the east coast of Ireland, and then the future developments will be off the south and west coast. But it's not just offshore wind development; it's all the infrastructure that needs to be put in place to deal with that offshore wind on land and transporting it either for use within Ireland, or exporting it via interconnectors or additional uses like hydrogen generation.
Are there projections about how many more interconnectors we might need in the near future?
I'll repeat that question because people watching online won't be able to hear it.
Sorry.
Any projections about the number of interconnectors we need in the future, Shane?
Our plan by 2030 is to have an additional 5 gigawatts of wind connected to the grid. And actually, we will need the technology for interconnectors, which is HVDC links and converter stations. We will need offshore converter stations and HVDC links also to bring that wind ashore, or to export it, or to transport it rather than across land, but around coastal areas out at sea.
One last question.
Can you give the microphone back again, because so the people watching online, and then Catherine wants to react as well, and then we go back to the questions on Slido. Okay, Liz, again.
Thanks, sorry. It just seems like a huge amount of work. I mean, do we have enough people that are working in the industry at the moment? Like, what are your recommendations around that? Do we need to be sizing up? Do we need to be focusing more on institutions like here to be training people? Or, I don't know, what do you think?
I love that you're thinking in systems thinking. This is the whole bit. You've got to consider the energy transition in terms of everything. So every gigawatt of offshore wind offers a potential of €2 billion to an economy. So we in Ireland can determine what element of that boost to the economy that we want to achieve, because the more people we have working in the energy transition, the more that people are going to feel that this is their energy transition. So they're going to grant the social license for the infrastructure that we need to develop out our renewable energy transition. The energy system of the future doesn't exist today, and we mustn't be hamstrung by what the status quo is. We've got 80 gigawatts of potential offshore wind off the coast of Ireland. At the moment, if you were to turn on all the washing machines and dryers at tea time, you'd get maybe about 12 gigawatts of need if you had enough wires there. So we've got more wind than we need. We in Ireland need to play a role for Europe in being a source of energy. We need loads of interconnectors, because when it's windy in Ireland, we can send it to France. And then when it's calm here, we can use the nuclear-powered French energy to import it here to Ireland. But even that's not going to be enough. We need to be able to store and transport. And that's why the Department of Environment and Climate and Communications are coming out with a hydrogen strategy for Ireland. And they're also coming out with a security of supply strategy for Ireland. So all these things are happening in relation to the amount of new professionals that we need in the system. Some of the work that's happening in UCC is incredible. There's 90% funded human capital initiative programs here that are preparing the next generation of energy professionals to take part in it. And that's the prize that's there for us. And people are more willing to change if we give them something to work towards than try to take away what they have right now.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. I think now at this stage we'll just move on to some of the questions that have been coming in online and on Slido, and then we'll move back in a little while again to the people in the room if you've got other questions. So the first question I'm going to throw out from Slido is to Professor Norton. I'm going to pick the bottom question on the screen for you, because I think that's really within your field of expertise. And the question is whether or not we're running the risk of over-engineering our society. Are we becoming too dependent on energy systems, which is one link of the chain, which can then be disrupted? And the questioner then asks the mitigations in place to ensure that no other country can have a stronghold on our energy supply. And I'm guessing that the questioner is thinking about the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but perhaps also maybe thinking along the lines of the fact that we get a lot of our energy supply in terms of gas through the UK, and what happens, if the relationship between Ireland and the UK turns sour. I mean, we've gone through a bad patch in relations with the UK because of the discussion on the Northern Ireland Protocol. So if that goes bad, is there an impact on Ireland? What happens then? Can we plug in our computers? What happens to our Wi-Fi? Our water in our taps perhaps has been pumped in our houses, no electricity. We can't wash ourselves. We can do nothing, Brian.
On that dystopian scenario, energy systems are complex. So when you talk about over-engineered, I think one of the things we do need to realise is, and some people in this room have heard me say this before, there is no silver bullet. There are a whole range of solutions that need to be made at a whole range of levels. A focus on the demand side, on actually reducing demand, making it affordable, etc., so that if you have well-insulated buildings, etc., that you've both reduced the overall demand in the system and you've made energy costs more affordable to consumers. So those things are important. Local energy storage is important, the ability to generate energy, if one can, locally, PV on the roof, etc., so that you get a more diverse, more resilient, more flexible system. Once you've got storage in a system, in a variety of means, at a variety of scales, you've got more adaptability adaptability to those changes, more resilience to exactly those kind of problems. And short-term storage in your hot water tank, in batteries, etc., at the domestic level, through to interseasonal storage, which could actually be hydrogen, will give you the kind of resilience to exactly the challenges that you describe. And we need, and it's been said already, a different paradigm from how we're looking at the energy system. And we're still perhaps stuck in an old-fashioned power planning paradigm, which had a central generating station that fed energy to people, and that was the arrangement, and energy wasn't necessarily stored, or you weren't aware that it was stored, and the consumer was not a participant in the market; they were literally a consumer. So I think there's a new paradigm with a lot more local renewable energy generation, with appropriate interconnection, and with different levels of storage at different scales and different time scales is the solution to that problem. But I would stress energy systems are not simple. Even our current energy system, you may not even realize it, is complex. There's oil, gas, coal. There's petrol, diesel vehicles. There's a complex set of it's already there. Okay, we just aren't aware of it. We aren't thinking about it, and we're replaced by an equally complex but different system.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. I mean, we're hearing a lot this afternoon about the need to convert energy and to store energy. And the next question I'm going to take from a Slido, I'm going to address to Catherine. And maybe it's a sort of a combination of possibility and engineering question. And it's from Conor O'Brien, and he asks whether or not it would be possible to store a hydrogen biogas mixture in the empty Kinsale gas field. Well, I don't know the answer to that myself. Maybe you don't know the answer to that yourself, but can you help us along the way?
Just to explain how the gas field works just very quickly. It's like, imagine a sponge, but the holes are really, really tiny, like they're only the size of the tip of a needle. So that's how small the holes are, and little bits of gas can get trapped in it. So you've got that porous rock, and then you've got what's called a cap rock over the top, and that's really, really solid, so nothing can get through it. So the Kinsale gas field is like that. You've got loads of holes that stored CH4, so that's biomethane, or that's methane CH4. And then when it was finished and when it's depleted, there's space in those. So what you can do is you can look at that from a geology point of view, and you can say, could you store hydrogen in that area? But H2, hydrogen, is smaller than CH4, so it mightn't be suitable. And that's why companies like ESB, working with SNAM and Decarbonex, are looking at other parts of the Kinsale Head gas field to see if there's other ones there. There's also salt caverns, and that's a different type of geology. But that's what you kind of need to do when you're talking about the amount of energy that we'd need to store in Ireland if we wanted to have indigenous energy storage. At the moment, we've got Turlough Hill, and what that is it's hydroelectric energy storage. So you pump water up high, and then it has the potential energy. But if we wanted to meet all of our energy security needs here, we'd need 15,000 of those. So it's just not possible. So that's why we need to look at the possibility of converting electricity into hydrogen. Electricity is spectacularly fantastic. Let's electrify as much as we can. Let's build out the grid. Let's reduce energy, and let's lose electricity wherever we can. But you need it instantaneously. So you need it to go to the grid. You can use batteries for short term or maybe medium term. But when you start storing it in a molecule form, it's easier to transport around the world as well. Ships, pipes, you could oversize your pipes. Gas Networks Ireland have, well, actually they don't, right? We citizens have a €2.7 billion asset called the Gas Network. At the moment it transports natural gas, but in the future it could be repurposed, some of it or all of it, to transport hydrogen. The European Union is looking at a hydrogen backbone study, that you could have a pipe going from Cork up to Dublin, up to the north of Ireland, over to Scotland and on into Europe. And some of the existing pipe network could be used for that. And the pipes themselves become a storage unit for hydrogen.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. I mean, that's fascinating. A lot of stuff there I never knew before.
A great crack in the pub, Tim, I promise.
The next question I'm going to pop at Shane, and it's from Dan Boyle, and it's Councillor Dan Boyle from the Green Party, who sits here in the front row. And Dan asks about the installation of solar panels on all public buildings, and asks whether or not there should be an EU programme which would maximise it. But I'm actually going to turn the question around a little bit, Shane. And can you give us some indication of, the possibility of using solar panels to feed into the national grid, what the effectiveness is, and how many panels it would actually need to make a difference? I know you can answer this question, like easy for you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, actually, in our shaping our electrical future plan, so there is a plan for over 500 megawatts, which that's let's say 500,000 homes, energy consumption equivalent, to be connected as micro PV as micro solar generation. So just homes roof generation over the next 8 years. The potential is huge, and the technology is there. There is, I think there was another question maybe I saw in terms of, are the resources there to do it to the levels that we require? But it certainly is in the plans, and has massive benefits.
Okay, and I understand as well now that many of the energy supplying companies are allowing people who have solar panels installed in their house to get a little premium, something less than €200 a year. I believe if it's more than 200, you've got to pay tax on it. But there is an incentive for people to put panels on their roofs now, isn't there?
There is an incentive, and there is the incentives are there coming on stream as well to sell the excess generation back into the grid. Now it's at the local distribution grid, which is managed by ESB networks rather than EirGrid. But I mean, yes, there's huge potential there, and it certainly should be policy.
Okay, so that's the two sides of the solar panel argument. You've got the commercial side, and then you've got the home microgeneration side, who can get a few euro by putting something up on their roof, which will probably pay back in 7 or 8 or 10 years, something like that. I'm guessing.
With the fluctuation in energy prices, Tim, it's hard to call these days, as the payback is much quicker now with the rising cost of electricity.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going. Oh, sorry. Get your microphone, Dan. This is Councillor Boyle with follow-up question.
Thank you. The intent of my question was that how do you quicken the actual application of the infrastructure? And I suppose what I had in mind was that the Regional Development Fund, as was, helped fund a network of motorways in this country, some of which weren't needed, and also helped magnify our carbon emissions. But if we cannot use the same principle to quicken and have a massive installation of solar panels, particularly on public buildings, we'd at least start the process in a significant way and help the energy cost of public services in this country, and give that a priority. That's the argument I'm trying to make.
No, I understand that argument perfectly, but from the European Union perspective, I mean, what happens is that we provide funding to member states through programmes. And the objective of the regional funds, in fact, was to bring up the GDP of Ireland to the average GDP level across Europe. And remember, when Ireland joined the EU, as it was at the time, EEC, 50 years ago, the GDP per head of population in Ireland was about 56% of the EU average. Okay, I looked at the figure for last year; it's 220%. Okay, now the thing is that the GDP per head of population is probably a bad measure, but you have to have some measure, because the GDP per head is influenced by the profits the foreign multinationals make, and that has been impacted by Ireland's investment policy. But anyway, nevertheless, the thing is that Ireland has become such a rich country, relatively speaking, that it no longer qualifies for many of the supports from the EU. And I mean, we're looking here at the Next Generation EU, which was the fund that the EU created after COVID to kickstart the European economy again. And for this fund, the EU actually borrowed money on the open market. The reality is that Ireland has only qualified for less than €1 billion under this fund, because Ireland is relatively speaking, such a rich country that it no longer qualifies under the criteria that we apply. Now, you could argue that we should use a different methodology for calculating the relative wealth of countries. And in fact, Ireland itself has changed its methodology to GNI star, is what it's called, which is a more reflective version of how good the economy actually is. But the reality is that when you look at GDP per head of population, Ireland is quite a rich country. But I see that Brian wants to come in on this point. Brian.
Yeah, as part of the same drivers for energy retrofitting of domestic buildings, there are drivers for energy retrofitting of non-domestic buildings, public buildings, etc. And eventually there will need to be a move towards net zero public buildings, of which PV generation is part. Interestingly, though, what's happening is because of the a variety of reasons that we don't have time to go into, PV costs continue to decline. And what you're seeing now is the market interventions like feed-in tariffs and others are no longer needed. It is actually the sensible thing to do as part of refurbishment. And we need to encourage that and encourage a self-sustaining industry. And you see that in the sense that people are now doing more self-consumption of the PV electricity rather than selling it to the grid, so that it becomes the obvious thing to do. It doesn't need to be incentivized. We're at the cusp of that change.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And the next question I'm going to pick, I'll come back to the audience in just a little while. I know there's a few questions coming up. But the next question I'm going to pick from the screen is the one which is addressed directly to Catherine, and it's from Valerie Gleeson. And she says that she loved Catherine's reference to a need for rebel spirit, with collaboration and partnership being central to the spirit. She wants to know, is this new way of thinking, this open mindset, is contrary to how we traditionally operated? And she wants to know what we as a people are doing to inspire and enable such a mindset shift. We spoke earlier about a paradigm shift, so maybe you just want to address that question from Valerie. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Is Valerie's not here, is she? She's online. So if we do things the way we've always done, we'll get what we've always got. So the first thing I think we need to do in the energy transition is to have a diversity of voices in the rooms where decisions are being made. We need to include people who have typically been excluded in relation to the types of people and the types of professions that they are. Like, instead of it just being like economists and engineers and ecologists, we need storytellers, we need artists, we need the gender divide to move closer to at least 30% of women involved in the energy sector, because that 30% is a magic number where after which that point it becomes more normal. So there's things like that we can do. I am loving working in the renewable energy sector because of the sense of collaboration. It's a can-do attitude of, well, let's do it and then ask permission afterwards, because we're not waiting for anybody to come and save us. We are the energy sector. It's up to us to do it. It's up to us to come with solutions to it. And I see it more and more. Like in the representative groups, Engineers Ireland are working together, bringing lots of different public and private and academics together to work on it. Wind Energy Ireland, Hydrogen Ireland, Cork Chamber, Energy Cork. There's all these organisations that are coming together. And it's this different cohort of people, but having open and collaborative conversations and bringing forward solutions and being solution focused rather than saying, here's the problem, who's coming on their white horse to save me. So I think the counterintuitive piece about how do we change things is consider them already changed and start acting as though we have no limits on our possibilities.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And there's a sort of a link question which I'm going to ask Shane to take, which is from John Stewart. And John asks whether or not the panel agrees that we have more work to do to communicate the economic and societal benefits of renewable energy to increase public support. And I'm addressing this particularly at you because you explained to us earlier in your presentation how it was that you felt that you got the local people on side when you told them you were going to put some infrastructure in their fields.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely very important to engage early on what the plans are. So actually, EirGrid won an award in 2020 for engagement with local communities around the Celtic Interconnector project from the EU Renewable Grids Initiative. And that was a full year before we actually submitted a planning application for the Celtic Interconnector. So that shows how early you need to be engaged with the communities so that they can feel that actually they do have a say in the decisions that are being made, that the decisions aren't already made, and that it's not just token engagement. So, on the likes of Celtic Interconnector, we had multiple sites on the table for the location of the converter stations and cable route selections. So, in terms of the amount of infrastructure that we do need to put in over the next year, over the next, I suppose, decade, it is critical that people know, it is there for a national benefit, but that they have had input into how it's actually done, rather than that it just gets done.
Yeah, I mean, I find that quite an interesting take, because one of the sort of implications from a question or from a reply earlier was that, the planning system was creating difficulties. But you're saying actually that you need deep consultation before you do anything. So maybe it's not such a bad thing to discuss things, to engage with people. The only difficulty is that then that slows down the whole process. So if, for example, you didn't start with this planning or this discussion with the people, how much time do you think that would have cut off your project? Difficult question, I know, but...
No, look, I think EirGrid has, a long history of building, of planning infrastructure in Ireland. So, I mean, we had that schedule built in to allow for that engagement. I mean, for example, on the Celtic interconnector, the underground cable is mostly in the public road, but it actually passes through upwards of 50 private landowners. We had engagement with them well in advance of submitting the planning application, so that there wasn't any objections from those landowners to the actual project. So there was no delay on our side in the planning process, because we engaged so early with the stakeholders in the project. But certainly, if we had not carried out that step, I think the planning step would have been significantly longer then.
That's interesting. So therefore, you think that with any large capital infrastructure, there are lessons to be learned from the approach that EirGrid took to this particular project?
Yeah, definitely. Early engagement is necessary. So again, to kind of reiterate, they need to have involvement in the decision-making process before the decisions are actually made.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
That's very clear. Okay. I'm actually going to go back to the audience now, because I see a few hands up. Can I start here at the back? A gentleman in a blue shirt. Just wait until the microphone gets to you. And then the man in the black shirt. And then the gentleman here with the blue sweater. So if you could, again, just tell us who you're from or if you're representing an organisation.
My name is David Canary, and I work for myself. I'm a consultant on infrastructure and energy projects. I have a question maybe for everyone. I mean, we might start with EirGrid, but including the moderator, I would appreciate your comments as well. As it stands, based on what you've said and what I've said and what I've heard recently, both from the Port of Cork and from Shannon Foyne's port, we're in a situation where we have to build multi-billion euro infrastructure programme to build offshore wind farms without access to central government funding, without access to local government funding, and now, as I have been indicating and others may have, that it is not for certain that we will get European funding. So does anyone know how we can fund a multi-billion infrastructure programme without public funding?
Okay, I think I'll actually ask Brian to comment on that, but before I do, maybe I would react and reiterate what I just replied to Councillor Boyle, in that all of the EU funding is done via programmes. And I mean, we understand the reality of what's happening. A lot of the infrastructure which is creating renewable energy came into sharp focus as a result of the increasing gas prices recently, because these companies had fixed costs and they managed to get what were called windfall profits from the generation. And then the question was, should these sort of companies be penalised because they planned and they invested in advance? But the reality is that, other than hydrogen, because we have promised that we will do some investments in hydrogen, I think that we're going to have to depend very much on the private sector and the banking sector to be able to provide the mezzanine funding or the funding for large-scale wind projects, because it does appear that they are profitable in the long term. Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, there is a whole renewable energy finance sector out there, and if the business case can be made, and for these projects, given the price of the energy they're substituting, the business case is more attractive day by day, you will get private finance. So I think also it would be interesting to know why there aren't the common good aspects of the projects, particularly if you link them with the earlier discussion interconnectors, aren't coming in for EU funding, and that position can still be made to the Commission. Nothing's ever cast in stone. This is the energy policy, energy finance strategy at European level is evolving still. So I still think there's that position to be made. I'd also be a little bit cautious, as I've said earlier on, about putting all one's eggs in heavy investment in supply side, and putting some of that investment in reduction of demand side is probably going to give a better return and a more resilient system overall. So I think there's again a question of balance in terms of the increase in production and the reduction in supply as well.
Okay, Brian, thanks for that. I promise we'll take 2 more questions from the audience before we went back to Slido. So the gentleman in the black shirt here, followed by the gentleman in the blue pullover, followed by the lady here in the front in the black cardigan.
My name is Michael Cronin. I'm just a private individual with an interest in microgeneration. And I want to thank the organisers and the panel for a very interesting discussion. If I could ask maybe 2 questions, one is local and the other is national. The local question is, would there be any use or possibility for a tidal power station at the mouth of Cork Harbour? It could help solve flooding issues in the city, generate power, and possibly you could drive along the top of it or cycle along the top of it and to provide an access east. And we already have a partial solution to flooding in Cork with the in Escara, so it could be 2 renewables providing a solution. And the other question is, I was wondering, in a national sense, would the panel have any advice for the energy regulator in Ireland going forward?
Okay, Michael, thanks very much for that. Catherine, can I pop those questions at you? The first question is whether or not we can find a multifunctional solution for Cork Harbour to build something that we can cycle across, stop the floods, and provide power. I'll leave it to you.
I have something in common with everyone. I have no idea what's going to come out of my mouth next. In relation to coming up with a local solution in relation to that, sometimes trying to retrofit 2 or 3 things into a combined solution sets you up for failure. I think that the research that's happening in Ringaskiddy in the National Maritime College and Marai in relation to tidal power in relation to that is ongoing, and it hasn't really been commercialised yet, and there could be maybe reasons in relation to that is wind has just stolen their march on it. It could be like that. The complexities around the flooding system for Cork and also how far it is along with the OPW, and there's so many aspects of that. I believe in accepting certain boundary conditions in trying to address the energy transition. So, for example, in Ireland, I don't think that there's going to be a U-turn on nuclear power, and I just accept that rather than trying to engage with it. Similarly, I think addressing the flooding issue in Cork versus developing tidal energy in a timeline that would address both problems, I think it's just being too complex, which is maybe the downside of always thinking from systems thinking, because you're always trying to find ways that solve more than one problem in relation to that. When it comes then to the regulator, it would be a piece that I would actually talk to it in relation to resourcing, and not just the regulator, like also the departments and the upcoming planning system and MARA. We cannot expect the same pool and the same number of people to address additional problems and additional workload without expanding the numbers. So we can't have a group that was set up to deal with the energy system of the 90s and the noughties and then have the same amount of people trying to address a further part. I would say that to address it, we could come up with a collaborative way of doing it. So one thing we could do is we could lean on the expertise within representative bodies and industry forums like Engineers Ireland, for example, to support the government in coming up with the policies, and the CRU, the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities, in relation to that. We could also charge the industry. Like, we could charge the large companies a lot of money if we were to give them certainty and timelines about when they get their planning decision. If it's supposed to be 18 weeks and a company find out within 18 weeks rather than 18 months, they're willing to pay for that higher standard of timeline and certainty. And that could equip us to recruit in short-term hires under the governance of the CRU and the other policy departments. So I think charge more and give a standard of service that will give certainty to the market that Ireland is a good place to do business.
Okay, Catherine, thanks for that. Brian wants to add to
just very briefly on the sort of the tidal energy side. The problem with the tidal barrage, and they exist, there's one in Laurence in Brittany, for example, is they are one-off projects in particular locations, and that makes them very, very expensive. and that's tended to mean that tidal energy has been seen as basically reversible wind turbines in the water, if you see what I mean, which you won't be able to cycle over. So, so I think that's more likely where that technology is going to go. And you probably will see that technology deployed at some point in the future, but probably not a barrage, because the one-offs of that kind of project simply are not competitive with other options.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Brian. I've got 2 more questions from the audience, and then we move back to the Slido questions. So, gentleman here in the blue pullover first, and then a lady here in the front with the black cardigan.
Hi everyone, my name is Barry Hayes. I'm from the School of Engineering here in UCC. And I have a question around the Celtic interconnector and around interconnectors in general. So we mentioned earlier in the discussion that on windy days we will be exporting energy across the interconnector to France and also across the interconnectors to the UK. But I'd be really interested to hear the panel's thoughts on, if we have 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, we'll have 10 gigawatts of wind overall in the country. And how confident are we that that will be the case? Will we be able to export that energy across the interconnectors? Will France, the UK, want to import that energy since they will have their own offshore wind resources in the North Sea? I'd just be really interested to hear the panel's thoughts on that point.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Barry. I think I'll address that question directly to Shane, because I mean you must have looked at the commerciality, if you could put it like that, of creating wind in Ireland, exporting it. Do people really want it? Nuclear energy is cheap in France. Will the French really want our wind energy from Connemara, wherever it's coming from?
Yeah, I mean the French, first of all, the French don't have sufficient nuclear energy to meet all their needs. And they are also looking for, a mix of energy. So that's why, the French they're joint venture partners in this project with us. And they are, looking for more interconnectors. The EU has targets of interconnection for countries to achieve. Celtic interconnector won't bring us halfway towards that target. So we need more interconnectors. We had, no problem to secure private financing for the Celtic Interconnector project. The commercial model is there. There's already an additional interconnector to the UK, Greenlink connector, in construction at the moment, and there's plans for a further private developer-led interconnector to the UK. So, the market is there. In terms of dealing with the amount of, offshore wind, for example, that's planned, it's a combined solution of usage of that power on the island, the likes of hydrogen generation, other demand-side users, but also, more interconnectors to France, to Spain, where there are markets that use that power. For example, Spain is developing solar energy, large solar farms. But wind and solar are somewhat complementary. On days when solar generation is very high, usually the wind is low. And likewise, on windy days, you usually have low solar. So, it's complementary technologies. And I think what we see in Europe is each country may be focusing on their strengths. Ireland has the resources for offshore wind. France already has a very mature nuclear industry. Spain is focusing on solar generation.
Okay, thanks, Shane. Can I ask you a sort of follow-up question, which links to a certain extent to the question you asked at the back about, the financing for wind energy projects. How crucial to your project was the funding that you got from the Connecting Europe facility? I mean, Connecting Europe is what it says on the tin. It is about connecting European infrastructure. In the past, we thought about roads, but now we're thinking about gas pipelines and energy pipelines. So can you just briefly tell us how crucial this was to your plan?
I think it was crucial really on 2 main points. First of all, securing the funding really secured that the project would go ahead. It also, imposed a definite timeline on us to utilize this funding. So it gave the project really the momentum to go forward and hit certain dates and targets. But then secondly, I said we have no problem securing private financing, but that is because the project is also grant funded, so it makes it a very attractive commercial proposition.
Okay, that's a very interesting answer, because it ties in a little bit with the question that you were asking earlier. It's a chicken and egg situation, which comes first, the private funding or the little grant funding. And I know that your project was certainly over €1 billion, and the granting that you got was something a little bit over 500 million. So a little bit less than half, I think, was funded from the EU.
Yeah, but look, I think in the case of projects like the Celtic Interconnector then do facilitate a more certain economic outlook for developers to invest in renewable energy.
Okay, I'm going to take one final question from the audience, and that's the lady here in the black jumper. Who's Mary Murphy, I believe.
Thanks, Tim. Mary C. Murphy from University College Cork. I just have a question about the all-island dimension to all of this, and maybe the politics around that. Because obviously we have an all-island single electricity market. And I just wonder about the extent to which Brexit, and then more recently the protocol, and the collapse of the institutions in Northern Ireland, what's the extent to which they have been a blockage in terms of some of this work and some of these efforts. And if they are a blockage, how politically charged they are, and whether you would be optimistic or confident that those difficulties might be overcome.
Thanks, Mary. I mean, that's a really political question that you're asking there. You're throwing everything into the mix. Single market, Brexit, protocol. You forgot about the change of prime ministers in the UK, but nevertheless. Brian, it's a tough question, but I think you've got the experience. Do you want to try it?
Yeah. For those of you who aren't aware of it, I spent a lot of my career in Northern Ireland, so I'm and indeed chaired the body that actually led to the single energy market. So anyway, I think actually the factor which has affected things right now is none of those. It's actually the outworking of the cash for ash scandal, and that has put renewables on the back foot in Northern Ireland in terms of a public profile. And there's a rebuilding of public confidence, which is partly to do with regulation, partly to do with the issues around that, which I think are part of the agenda in making this a more public part of it. Operationally, things are working behind the scenes well, but the problem, I think, is in having a vision for an all-island energy market, which is tenable outside of other political dimensions. And I personally do think that's possible. You look at the common travel area working well, for example, and I always draw the example of Norway being in the Nordic common travel area, but not in the EU, and there being able to be energy markets and things that work well there. So there are, although I repeat my earlier comment, be very careful of taking things from elsewhere and just transplanting them, because that sometimes doesn't work. So there are models of where it can go, but I do think that to get real traction, I think the political situation, one way or another, within Northern Ireland and between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK in the context of Brexit, does need to be resolved, and there's no getting away from that.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Brian. I'm just going to do one more question from Slido, and then I'm going to ask the panel to sum up. But the question I'm picking from the list of a lot of questions that we got in over Slido is from Roisin O'Sullivan. And I'm not sure if Roisin is from Cork or not, but it appears, reading her question, she may be, because she asks what the panel think of the realistic possibility of Ireland becoming a market leader in renewable energy across the EU member states. Are we seen as a laggard? Do we just talk the talk and not walk the walk? In other words, are we going to be big? Will we ever be big in renewable energy? Cork people.
Again, it's back to this point that value creation in renewable energy isn't a zero-sum game. So we don't want to be the best at everything. We want to identify, which is hard, like when we're from Cork, but what we want to do is we want to identify the part of the renewable energy sector that is appropriate for Ireland and for Cork to be the experts at. And we want to become really, really good at that in a way that complements other parts of the energy system. So recently, some of my Cork Chamber colleagues and renewable energy companies around Cork, we had a roundtable discussion with the Welsh First Minister, who was visiting with Simon Coveney, coming to Cork exactly for this reason. because we have an area of expertise here and we have a unique confluence of companies, geography, and institutions here in Cork that can set us up to play a key role. But we don't want to compete, for example, with Wales in relation to that. What we want to do is identify complementary elements of the energy transition where we can, instead of us having to do all of it and Wales having to do all of it, that we build in a little bit of redundancy across the both so that we can support each other. And that's the new form of doing things. And the reason why I think Cork, on top of all those reasons, is it has that collaborative mindset of pulling together and short-circuiting and driving on and getting things done and not thinking of all the reasons why we can't, but just thinking of all the reasons that we can and driving on with those ones.
Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. We're coming to the end of the session. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each of the panel members just 2 minutes to give us their reflection on the subject matter of today's event, which was called Energy for the Future, Renewable, Sustainable, Affordable. And just 2 minutes from each person, please. We start with Brian, then we'll do Catherine, and then we'll do Shane. So Brian, please.
Thank you. No, I think the key message is, and reflecting a lot of the comments, is participation in the debate, that we can't wait for other people to do it. We've got to do it ourselves. And this needs to be consistently in the political agenda, and it also needs to reflect that there will be a diversity of solutions and varieties of scale, not a silver bullet comment, and advocate for very strong regulation of markets that protect consumers. And I think that will be key. Also, I think ambition. For example, there's PV manufacturing in Europe at a very tiny scale. That's going to grow. Why isn't that in Ireland? So also having ambition for things as well beyond where we are now.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Catherine, your 2 minutes, starting now.
So I work with a company called EIH2 in Green Rebel, and one of our values is to be a rebel. So I challenge everyone in the room to not determine whether they're optimistic or pessimistic about the future, but just determine what's the next right step that they can take. Who can you bring within the tent in the energy transition, and what role can you play?
Okay, nice thought. Shane, you're last to speak. 2 minutes.
No, just I'm really, I suppose, positive for the future, and I'm just excited, I suppose, to be part of the solution and facilitating so many different technologies that can get us to where we want to be in 2030 and forward to hopefully a carbon zero future.
Okay, thank you so much. Listen, I want to thank the panel for their very interesting contributions today. Shane, Catherine, and Brian, it was fabulous. Thank you so much. I want to thank you, the audience, for being here today, for listening to the presentation, for being such a great audience, and not just the audience physically here, but also the people who are watching on YouTube and who maybe watch it back in due course, because I think this is a hugely interesting and fascinating subject, and I think we were really lucky that we had such three magnificent speakers here today. And finally, I want to thank the colleagues in the European Movement Ireland for making all of this come together for us, and our sound people here who are walking around with the microphone and making sure that everything's fine. So listen, thank you so much. It's been our pleasure to host this event today. Our last event in this series will be in Sligo in 2 weeks' time. So this is a series of 4 events which are running in different places around the country. The objective was to get out of Dublin, to create the discussion about energy, about this important issue outside of the Dublin bubble, if you wish to put it like that. So I think we had a great panel here today with some great subjects, great questions. Thank you all. Have a nice afternoon.
You care about your family, your friends, and your kids' future. That's why you want to protect the climate and the planet. You stand up for your values.
You believe in democracy and in freedom, and in clean renewable energy made in Europe. Sure, there's a lot to do, and we can do it. We're in this together. We're you.
You are Europe.